Good morning again, First Congo. This morning, I want to talk to you about beards. I want to talk to you about pagan sacrifices and doing the dishes. I want to talk to you about sugar-free grape juice. Before I do any of that, though, here's an ancient letter written to an ancient group of people trying their level best to follow Jesus. First Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 13. The question keeps coming up regarding meat that has been sacrificed to an idol. Should you attend meals where such meat is served or not? We sometimes tend to think we know all we need to know to answer these kinds of questions, but sometimes our humble hearts can help us more than our proud minds. We never really know enough until we recognize that God alone knows it all. Some people say quite rightly that idols have no actual existence, that there's nothing to them, that there is no God other than our one God, that no matter how many of these so-called gods are named and worshipped, they still don't add up to anything but a tall story. They say, again, quite rightly, that there is only one God, the origin and source, that everything comes therefrom, and that God wants us to live for God. Also, they say that there is only one teacher, Jesus, the Messiah, and that everything is for his sake, including us. Yes, it's true. In strict logic, then, nothing happened to the meat when it was offered up to an idol. It's just like any other meat. I know that, and you know that, but knowing isn't everything. If it becomes everything, some people end up as know-it-alls who treat others as know-nothings. Real knowledge isn't that insensitive. We need to be sensitive to the fact that we're not all the same and at the same level of understanding in this. Some of you have spent your entire lives eating idol meat and are sure that there's something bad in the meat that then becomes something bad inside of you. An imagination and conscience shaped under those conditions isn't going to change overnight. But fortunately, God doesn't grade us on our diet. We're neither commended when we clean our plates nor reprimanded when we just can't stomach it. But God does care when you use your freedom carelessly in a way that leads to a fellow believer still vulnerable to those old associations to be thrown off track. For instance, say you flaunt your freedom by going to a banquet thrown in honor of idols where the main course is meat sacrificed to idols. Isn't there great danger if someone still struggling over this issue, someone who looks up to you as knowledgeable and mature, sees you go into that banquet? The danger is that that person will become terribly confused, maybe even to the point of getting mixed up in themselves about what their conscience tells them is wrong. Christ gave up his life for that person. Wouldn't you at least be willing to give up going to dinner for him? Because as you say, it doesn't really make any difference. But it does make a difference if you hurt your friend terribly, risking their eternal ruin. When you hurt your friend, you hurt Christ. A free meal here and there isn't worth it at the cost of even one of these quote-unquote weak ones. So never go to these idol-tainted meals if there's any chance it will trip up one of your brothers or sisters or siblings. When folks think of churches splitting apart, they often think of finances. One contingent of the church thinks money should be spent on building repairs, for example, while another contingent of the church thinks money should be spent on adding childcare staff, let's say, and the two contingents just can't coexist. When folks think of church splits, very often stories of staff conflict come to mind. The drama that ensues when the senior pastor and the associate pastor, for example, just can't get along, so allegiances get drawn and the two sides duke it out until one pastor leaves and takes half the congregation too. You know, the longer I do this work, though, the more stories I hear about church splits where the stakes would appear to be, well, not all that high. The pettier wedges that have driven churches apart include whether or not congregants have access to the church copy machine. Another not so uncommon wedge is the question of who gets to decide what type of coffee is served after worship. Churches split over whether or not sugar-free grape juice is an orthodox substitute for wine during communion. Churches split over sanctuary decorations, plastic plants versus real plants, Christmas trees versus no Christmas trees, American flags versus no American flags. In the 70s, apparently, a not insignificant number of churches split over the question of whether or not pastors should have beards. Now, this isn't the reason, by the way, that I shaved mine off. That was just because I forgot what my face looks like without hair. Stories like these are part of what turn people off from church, aren't they? For many of us, we go to church to escape the troubles and the trivialities of the world. We don't want a front row seat to them. After spending the week arguing with our spouse over the way to load the dishwasher, we go to church hoping to be among people who are talking about important, spiritual, holy stuff. Having been in fights with our friends, spoken or unspoken, over this passive-aggressive comment or that one, we come to church hoping to be inspired and invigorated. When we know that Monday we'll go back to work and contend with petty fights over where the stapler is supposed to be, we come to church in search of solace and hope. But then we get to church and we discover, well, people. We discover battles over the right way to fold napkins. We find arguments over how the music should sound, or how a program should be run, or when an event should happen. We go to church looking for peace and find instead people. Then, when we read passages in Scripture like this one from First Corinthians, we find that church folk have been arguing and bickering and battling since the beginning of this whole church thing. A question keeps coming up, Paul says. But Paul, like most of us when we stop to breathe and reflect, knows that the questions that keep coming up are rarely about the stated question itself. The question that keeps coming up in today's passage isn't really about food. The questions are never really about coffee or beards or sugar-free grape juice. The questions aren't ever really even about finances or personalities. The questions aren't ever really even about whether the bowls should go on the bottom rack of the dishwasher, which they shouldn't, of course, or on the top rack of the dishwasher, the place any sane person would obviously place them. No, the questions at play when it comes to people are almost always about 3 A words: authority, acknowledgement, and acceptance. When people argue over who gets to decide this or that, be it the temperature at which the thermostat should be set at, or what font should be used in the church bulletin, what's actually at stake for us is the question of who has authority. Is it a person? Is it this person? Is it a family? Is it a committee? Is it everybody? Who ultimately has the authority and the power to decide? However, this A word often only matters because of the second A word, acknowledgement. Each and every one of us craves acknowledgement. We want to know that we matter. We want to know that our opinion has gravity and our perspective has weight. We want to be consulted, many of us, particularly when an issue affects us in some deep way. Ultimately, though, we want acknowledgement because most deeply, we want acceptance. We want to know that we belong in a friendship, in a marriage, in a family, in a church, in a community, in a city, in a country, in the world. Each and every one of us wants to know that we are accepted as an integral part of the group that matters to us. And if we don't feel that acceptance, if we feel overlooked or undervalued, well, very often we feel threatened. We worry that we're liable to be left out or left behind or left in the lurch as the rest of our group, our family, our friends, our country moves right along, planning and plotting and gleefully pushing into a future that doesn't include us. Without the authority of influence, feeling as if we aren't acknowledged, anxious that we aren't accepted, we start to feel every social animal's greatest fear: rejection. Inclusion in the group is how social animals have survived. And so, what often happens when that fear of rejection comes up is that we do what any scared animal does. We fight. We complain. We protest. We accuse, and we raise our voices. No, I've told you 1,000 times, when you make the bed, you need to tuck the top sheet under the mattress first, then put the comforter on top. Who decided that we should be using Folgers instead of Starbucks coffee? Since when have beards been suitable for clergy folk? How dare you suggest that trans women should be allowed to compete in this sport? Since when is it okay for a white man to be passed over for a job so that a black woman can get hired? That fear of being rejected from the group leads us to draw battle lines. It leads us to exaggerate and contort reality, because if we're not going to be included, then at least we sometimes decide we're going to be right. So we consult our memories in order to gather evidence, and we build a case. You don't make the bed right because you don't care what I think. Just like when we were taking that road trip and I told you to get off at exit 3, but you just had to get off at exit 4, and then we got lost. This church just keeps using Folgers instead of Starbucks, just like when you all didn't listen to me when I said we needed 3 bowls of potato salad instead of just 2 at the potluck, and then some folks didn't get potato salad. Given enough time to ruminate and build a convincing enough case, before long, we'll do the second thing that any scared animal does, and we'll flee. Forget this church, I'm done. Forget this marriage, it's not worth it. Forget this city, forget this country, forget this world. I clearly don't belong here. This is what is at stake in the portion of Paul's letter to the Corinthians that we read today. He knew this fledgling Christian movement was on the brink of dissolution, and it was all coming down to questions that would not quit. One that was particularly persistent had to do with Christians who were friends with pagans. So imagine that you're a citizen of the ancient city of Corinth, and you've gotten caught up in the story and the power and the witness and the teachings of Jesus. You start going to church and reflecting on the scriptures and adopting new habits. But then your friend, who's still a pagan, invites you over for dinner. As pagans are wont to do in this time and in this place, in the process of preparing the meal, they kill a goat or a chicken or a cow in honor of Zeus, let's say. Now you, a Christian, must decide, do I eat this meat? Is this okay? And because people answered that question differently, it kept coming up. An idle inquiry turns into a big old controversy. Suddenly sides appear and contingents get claimed. Before long, every mixed religious party becomes a possible problem. Paul, these early Christians write, Paul, tell us who's right. Who has the authority here? Acknowledge the right side. Tell us who's really accepted in this new faith we're forging together. We have to know. We have to know. Look at what Paul does, though. Rather than declare a victor, he goes after the real issue, the question beneath the question, and he provides a way forward, not just for those ancient Christians, but I would argue, for all of us. We sometimes think we know all we need to know, Paul writes to these aspiring Christians in Corinth. We sometimes think we know we're right, that our perspective is accurate, that our way is most efficient, that our opinion is most orthodox. But, he goes on, sometimes our humble hearts can help us more than our proud minds. In other words, when it comes to the questions that will not quit, we're often tempted to rely on knowledge. We're tempted to rely on our facts, on our figures, our data, our memories, our evidence, all to prove that we know best, that our preferences should prevail. However, in fact, in order to get at the deeper issues, in order to address those 3 A words that truly matter, we need to consult not our minds, but our hearts, Paul tells us. Rather than know and argue for your preferences, you need to feel and humbly trust our purposes as a people, as a community, as brothers and sisters and siblings given life by one God. Rather than, in other words, focusing on the question of how the dishes get done, or how the laundry gets washed, or how the beds get made, rather than advocating for what you know to be the right way, try reconnecting with the truth of why you're even together in the first place. When you get in one of those gnarly tangles with your loved one, try taking a step back and humbly refocusing on your purposes as a unit. Mutuality, cooperation, doing your level best to make a loving life together. Rather than, in other words, focusing your energy on your preferences for how worship should go, or how this should be managed, or how the baby boomers can't get it right, or how the millennials keep getting it wrong, rather than zeroing in on your preferences for doing church, maybe let's get rooted in our purpose for being church, drying each other's tears, making space for silence, remembering the joy of life, stirring in each other, say it with me if you know it, hope, courage, and faith. Rather than focusing all our political conversations around wokeness and MAGA mania, enumerating endless lists of policy preferences we refuse to budge on, maybe we can spend a little more time reconnecting with what our purposes are as a country, being this 250-year-old experiment in securing life, liberty, and happiness for a wild, motley crew of different kinds of people. Now, I'm not trying to say that focusing more on our purposes than we do on our preferences is going to fix everything. But it seems to me, and what Paul seemed to say, is that unless we can humbly root down into the heart of why we're even together, then we'll never be able to think beyond the particular way we want things to be. Releasing our grip on our own self-righteous ways of being, that might not be able to fix everything, but we likely can't fix anything unless we try. Unless we try to lean into humility and heart. The alternative is that we stay stuck, holding tight to our own way of doing things, surrounded by allies and comrades rather than friends, that is, people with whom we may sometimes disagree. The alternative is to let beards and gender and music styles and Christmas trees and history curricula and pronouns and food preferences be maybe the literal end of the world. I think we can do better than that. We are certainly called to be better than that, because church is not a place we go to in order to escape the bickering. You can read First Corinthians and see that. Church, I believe, is the place we go to in order to learn how to bicker. We come here and read ancient letters and ancient stories and ancient truths that make clear that people are people, always have been and always will be. And so, we come here to learn how to discern our way through the questions that will not quit. to learn how to set down our pride-ridden preferences in order to further the purposes of God's vision for us as a community, as individuals. We come here to remember that life is large and luscious and ultimately oriented around love. We come here to remember that we are called to the freedom that follows a humble heart, that we find authority in our efforts to hold grace, that we find acknowledgement in the God who knit us together in the womb, that we find acceptance always and endlessly in the mysterious power and love we call God. In coming here, you take up the invitation to let your life be unwritten, accepting the deep and ancient wisdom that you can't write your life alone. You belong to a divine reality that is unknowable. You belong to a reality that is deep and diverse. You are part of a people that is desperately needful of your presence and your grace and your beautiful heart. May it be so, and amen. We now worship God.